The first Federal Highway Act was actually passed in 1916, providing $75 million of federal money in 50-50 matching funds to the states. The Federal Aid Road Act was instrumental in extending and improving the country's road system. Road conditions were very poor before this law was passed, a lot of them little more than muddy trails. Growing interest in road improvements was influenced by farmers who needed roads, by the introduction of rural free delivery by the Postal Service, and of course by the increasing popularity of cars. By 1917, every state had a highway agency to administer federal funds. This was a Woodrow Wilson program. Wilson had run on a platform that included better roads. As you can see, he thought it was important for creating a prosperous country. Wilson provided federal funds for roads that were open to the public. World War I slowed down progress, and there was not another law passed or more funding provided again until 1921. There were various permutations of the Federal Aid Highway Act that popped up again from 1921 through 1987. The zealous highway building campaign that gave us the interstate system that we know today was going on during the 1950s and 60s. It was driven by the increased use of cars, increased suburbanization supported by cars, and supported by the GI Bill and new mortgage lending programs that were created after World War II. The interstate highway construction that had been proposed for years became a reality with the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act of 1956.
In this century, America has become a nation on wheels. We ride on wheels to work, to shop, to play, to go about any place we want to go. We depend on wheels to bring us the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the things we use. But when we depend on wheels, we depend also on highways and roads and streets for the wheels to roll on. And therein lies the challenge, building highways and roads and streets fast enough to keep up with the need. After World War II, the nation began developing a case of acute congestion that cost us millions of dollars a year in time, equipment, and lives. By 1956, there were more than 65 million cars on our roads, with 90 million forecast by 1975. Clearly, it was a time for national action. Congress responded with the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, providing the staggering sum of $51 billion to be spent by the states on highway construction by 1971.
The interstate system today is made up of more than 50,000 miles of roads and has cost more than $450 billion. It is arguably the largest public works project in the world. This construction all went on before the federal government even had a Department of Transportation. Before the DOT was created, the Federal Highway Program was a federal-state partnership with an emphasis on the state's authority, meaning despite the majority of the funding being federal, it was generally the states that made decisions like road locations and design choices. Use of funding was considered to be within the discretion of the states, and there wasn't really much federal oversight. The 90th Congress, the same one that would create the National Historic Preservation Act, pushed for highway building all over the country. Because of the nature of how destructive this construction could be on the built and natural environment, Congress was faced with a decision about how road building was going to continue. Senator Ralph Yarborough of Texas introduced a Parkland Preservation Amendment to the Federal Aid Highway Act, the act that had first been passed in 1916. It would be called the Yarborough Amendment. The senator from Texas had a specific interest in saving Brackenridge Park in San Antonio, Texas, a massive park located on the outskirts of a densely populated San Antonio. Brackenridge had sunken gardens, an open theater, 2 golf courses, a zoo, picnic areas, nature trails, and lots of open park space. A proposed road was going to link the downtown with the airport and was going to destroy 116 to 250 acres of the park. Yarborough wanted to stop the use of these types of parklands for road building. He proposed to amend the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1966 with the sponsorship of the Public Works Committee. Here are the provisions for the amendment that were accepted for the law. Although diluted from Yarborough's original proposal, these changes were still a coup for preservation. The amendment set a national transportation policy of maximizing efforts to preserve government parklands and historic sites. Federal and state governments were to cooperate in developing highway programs to this end, and there had to be planning to minimize harm. For the first time, there was a mandate for the federal administrators of the highway program to reject programs that would harm parks or historic sites, unless there were no other feasible options. At the same time, the Government Operations Committee was proposing the Department of Transportation Act. The DOT Act, also of 1966, incorporated provisions based on the Yarborough Amendment that were less diluted. The aspect of the law that is important to historic preservation law is Section 4F. The DOT Act clearly states it is the transportation policy of the U.S. government to preserve the natural beauty of countryside, parks, recreation areas, waterfowl refuges, and historic sites. This is to be accomplished through the cooperation and consultation of a Secretary of Transportation, the Secretaries of Interior, Housing and Urban Development, Agriculture, and the states in the development of transportation plans and programs. The DOT Act is not another stop-and-look idea. It mandates that in developing plans and programs, the DOT must include measures to maintain or enhance the natural beauty of lands that are crossed by transportation activities or facilities. Section 4F provides that a federal transportation program or project can only adversely affect land of significance if there is no feasible and prudent alternative to using the land, and only if the program or the project maximizes planning to minimize harm to the protected historic site. If there are prudent or feasible alternatives, or if the program or project planning fails to minimize the harm, then it can't proceed. 4F works closely in conjunction with Section 106 and NEPA review. In fact, the regs associated with the law require this overlap. 4F applies to the operations covered by the DOT. That includes the actions of the Highway Department, the Coast Guard, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Urban Mass Transportation Program, the Federal Railroad Administration, and the St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation. Although in this section you're going to focus mainly on transportation in the context of highway building. In that context, there are a few questions you're going to need to answer. What are 4F resources? What is use? What is feasible and prudent? How can we minimize harm? What is a de minimis impact? Before you move on, please take a few minutes to read the law that follows. When you come back, you'll learn the answers to these questions.